Let's talk more then about the election in Zimbabwe. Bring in political analyst Dr. Alexander Rusero. Dr. Rusero, a very good evening to you. Welcome to News at Prime. How significant is it, firstly, that even SADC is speaking so openly, at least the observer mission, about flaws, shortcomings, if you will, in the electoral process in Zimbabwe this past week?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on this special program. Yeah, it is significant because it also casts a good image on SADC, because over the years SADC has been accused as a regional bloc that stands for ZANU-PF elite preservation. There has been a sustained narrative over the years that SADC fights in ZANU-PF's corner. But this puts that kind of narrative to rest, because what is happening is that SADC has also come out from the regional politics cocoon to say, no, you could have done better on A, B, C, D. But it is important to also not blow out of proportion what SADC has pointed out, because remember, regional organizations, they operate on the basis of consultation, consensus, and cooperation as opposed to coercion. But it's only unfortunate because I think ZANU-PF's militant response has actually escalated this out of proportion. But I still insist and maintain that the report of SADC was actually progressive, and it's something that Zimbabwe can actually harness for its perfection of elections in the future.
Do you think that report by SADC will be taken seriously, though, when you consider that ZANU-PF, through its representatives, still says it believes that this was a free, fair and credible election process? I mean, they point, for example, to things such as the extension in voting for a second day when there was the shortage of ballot papers on Wednesday. They say everyone was allowed to campaign, even though we know the CCC had complained during the campaigning process that places where it was supposed to rally was suddenly unavailable or they were denied permission. So will anyone within the ruling party take SADC or any other observer mission that raises any form of criticism seriously?
Actually, everyone is taking that report seriously. That's why we have had several press statements. I think it is not a common feature to have more than 5 press conferences inside the 24 hours. Actually addressing one and the same issue of the Mumba-led SADC observation mission report. So that alone tells you the nature of seriousness. But maybe what you want to look at is to what extent will this have an impact on the way forward? I think there has to be certain consensus of some sort, firstly within Zimbabwe by the protagonists that are not agreeing on this election in form of ZANU-PF and CCC. But unfortunately, each time there are talks, people rush into conclusion to perceive talks as a pathway to some GNU of some sort. No, it is unhealthy as it has become fashionable in Zimbabwe to have political protagonists who contest in an election perceiving each other as enemies as opposed to opponents.
But have the chips fallen then, on that note, have the chips fallen exactly as expected? By that I mean, was this always going to be a disputed election, whichever way the result had emerged?
Disputed elections are a common feature in Africa, but what is more important is to what extent are regional monitors, continental monitors and international monitors, how far do they also input to ensure that we avoid this kind of thing all over again each time we have an election? So the SADC report itself is a wake-up call. I am very sure whatever the outcome of the circumstances that we find ourselves in Zimbabwe right now, I am very sure should ZANU-PF be in power in 2028, they are actually going to do things differently from the way they have done things in this election. Because this election, its clumsiness is for all to see. It was one of the most clumsy elections post-2000. It was very clumsy in its organization, in its operation. But unfortunately, ZANU-PF is behaving like the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. And the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission also at times behaves like ZANU-PF. This is a Zimbabwe Electoral Commission issue for them to respond and answer. But ZANU-PF, each accusation, ZANU-PF is always quick to jump into the defense mode, which at times is not helpful and is very retrogressive of a ruling party that is soliciting solidarity, assistance, and the much-needed cooperation and consent of all other member states. You can't be correct all the time,
right,
and others are wrong all the time. That's political arrogance.
Is the Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe at all credible? Does it hold any credibility at this stage?
The fact that opposition parties, they still go ahead, forge ahead and contest, it means there is some form of benefit of doubt. I do not necessarily think that ZEC is not credible, but maybe what you may want to know is maybe ZEC is not autonomous. Maybe there are certain powers that be where these things are decided, which are outside the parameters of ZEC. But I personally, I am convicted that ZEC is as competent as any other constitutionally found commission in Zimbabwe. But maybe because elections in Zimbabwe, remember, they are still perceived as a site of struggle. Elections are still perceived as a warfare, as some good versus evil kind of scenario. So there are certain invisible hands that could play. But to overly dismiss ZEC as an incompetent and a not so credible commission would not be overly fair.
You mentioned earlier what comes after this, what happens next. ZANU-PF says, well, those who aren't happy with the election outcome should seek relief via the legal system, the courts in the country. Do you think the CCC will find any joy from that? Is there any point to going to court at this stage?
The problem in Zimbabwe is that the court's outcome are for most of the time very predictable. We all know what is likely to happen when affairs of this nature are taken to court. There is no solace at all to say seek legal recourse. The elections are purely political. It is actually also very unfair for an election where more than 4 million people voted for that kind of a dispute to be settled by unelected officials, wearing those colonial wigs, sitting on a bench. That's an abrogation to democracy. This is purely a political and not a legal matter. There has to be some political resolving of this dispute as opposed to the legal resolving, because the legal approaches to this kind of thing, they have no recourse to the political tensions, the political crisis. It will not resolve the future political tensions, which Zimbabwe will be good if they do away with that kind of tensions if we want to progress as a nation. We cannot afford to continue having elections as a case of unfinished business. We must reach at a scenario, especially 43 years after independence, to realize that no, elections are just a contest for governance and not necessarily a site of struggle. So I personally
how do you get there? How does Zimbabwe get to that point? How does Zimbabwe get to the point where elections are viewed differently, or there are means to achieve perhaps a different objective when you consider the history around elections? I mean, for the past 20 years, there have been claims that the ZANU-PF has rigged, manipulated the system, abused voters, etc. Claims it's denied throughout, even though there have been multiple reports to the contrary.
I think elections in Zimbabwe, the elections fiasco in Zimbabwe, they are very indicative of the fact that as it stands right now, from a philosophical and academic point of view, Zimbabwe is an outpost of coloniality. Colonialism could have gone, but coloniality is still within us. We have just transcended from settler colonialism to the current kind of native colonialism, because this very same system that was used by the colonialists to deprive the blacks of their rights, of their fundamental freedoms. These systems are still in place. They have not been dismantled. It is ironic that ZANU-PF, which is now 60 years old, which fought tooth and nail for the right to vote, for the right to democracy, it should actually be the vanguard that jealously guards the sacrosanctness of the vote, because they tirelessly fought for this thing. But unfortunately, our elections are reduced into a charade, into some ritual, into some formality, because ZANU-PF is no longer even taking elections seriously, because at the end of the day, they will still prevail. It is unhealthy for a country that aspires to be a democracy to have predictive processes of this nature, especially with regards to an election, with regards to the undisputed realities that there is also a popular opposition that commands popular support from the masses, from the people.
Professor Alexander Rusero, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time on News at Prime.